Hello and welcome back as we get ready for the Screwtape Letters, which, as you probably already know, is really just a source of immense wisdom, of immense insights, as we get a better understanding of what the diabolical looks like, of what temptation really is, and how to see that in our everyday, mundane lives. Now, this is a book that I first read back in, I don't know if it was high school or maybe early college, and I already told you that at that point, I really wasn't a very avid reader, but this is a book that I read. This is a book that really stuck with me. And as I've revisited it in recent years, I've only come to appreciate it even more and recognize the reality, the wisdom that it holds for us. And I don't bring this up very often, except for when it actually has some use to do so. But I have a PhD in theology. I've done a lot of reading, and I really believe that I could scrap 80% of the reading that I did for my schooling and replace that with a few Lewis books, and I'd probably be better off for it. I think that most people would. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about the substantial classic text. I'm not talking about your Augustine or your Aquinas or things like that. But as far as the reading I've done from authors from the last 200 years or so, most of that has just come and gone, and I don't think that I'm really worse off for leaving it behind. Because one thing that separates Lewis out from the academic vortex, from institutional academia, is that even though he was a brilliant scholar in his own right, he really was a lover of ideas. He was a lover of wisdom. He was a lover of stories. He was a lover of learning. And that's different than somebody who is simply out to make a name for themselves, somebody who's simply out to create a platform. And Lewis often points this out, that institutional academia has a tendency to fall in love with its own reason, to fall in love with abstraction in a way that separates it out from real human experience and causes it to really fall into the same sin of Satan, which is the fact that he fell in love with his own reason, his own ability to reach forward, as Weston or the Unman told us in Perelandra. As with Tolkien's Morgoth, he's out in the void looking for the imperishable fire that dwells with Eru Ilúvatar alone. And this is the direction that academia tends to make. In fact, it's really where it pushes young academics to go. Right? You have to find some niche subject that nobody's ever written about, so that way you can get your name attached to this small little corner of learning that odds are nobody else is ever going to look at again, but at least you got your name on something. And so then you have to continue to do this again and again and again, right? Publish or perish, as they say. And so you're constantly forced to innovate, to reach into the void in order to create a platform for yourself. Whereas you go to someone like Lewis, I think we really see somebody who loves ideas, someone who loves stories, somebody who loves learning. And I mean, that is what a true philosopher is, right? The Phileo Sophia, this is the love of wisdom. A true philosopher is a lover of wisdom, not just somebody trying to make their voice heard, to speak their truth or whatever nonsense we want to use there. In fact, we're going to see that it is that authentic love, that pursuit of genuine humanity that makes Screwtape so insightful, so convincing, so helpful. In fact, he says in the 1961 prologue that some people assumed that he was able to write Screwtape because he's had such advanced learning and has engaged in such complicated thought concerning theology and morality and that sort of thing. But his response is no. The reason why he's able to write so well about temptation is he knows what it's like to be tempted. He knows the wickedness of his own heart, and that's what allows him to project this into the demon Screwtape. And so what we see in Lewis is this unique blend of complicated, difficult, dense learning that is really brought into an authentic spirit who understands himself and is seeking to better understand the world around him, and ultimately is trying to move up the chain of being to God himself. Now, that doesn't mean he was perfect. That doesn't mean he doesn't have any areas where we can criticize him. In fact, I think that we most certainly should. And so I'm not arguing for his canonization by any means, but I do think that we see a unique individual here, and I think that this really does come out in Screwtape Letters. Now, before we jump into the prologue and some related information, I do want to go ahead and talk about some of the supplemental reading that I'm recommending to you. I really like this annotated edition of the Screwtape Letters. It has very aesthetically pleasing print and formatting. It has a lot of notes that go into some historical and cultural background information for things that might have been lost to us since the time that this was written. It goes into a lot of cross-references with other of Lewis's works, provides a lot of literary backgrounds for different references that are made in the letters, and so it's very helpful. It looks really nice. I strongly recommend it. Next, I'm recommending Brenton Dickinson's article, A Cosmic Find in the Screwtape Letters. I'll talk more about that in just a little bit, but that link is provided in the supplemental reading page. Also, I'd like to recommend Lewis's A Preface to Paradise Lost. Now, even if you've never read Paradise Lost, even if you never read Paradise Lost, which you should at some point, but even if you don't, this is a book that can stand on its own, and you would be better for picking it up and reading it through. It provides a great introduction to Lewis's literary criticism, gives a lot of really helpful insights regarding literary form of poetry, form of stories, that sort of thing, different forms of epic poetry. And so we get some comparisons and contrasts between Milton with Virgil and Beowulf and Homer. And in fact, I'm also going to recommend this for the upcoming Beowulf and Boethius study. And so if you're going to take that course as well, then this is definitely something that you should pick up. But also, he's going to obviously set us up for Paradise Lost, and so he's going to give us some good thematic analyses, including the nature and activity of Satan. Now, even in the 1961 prologue to Screwtape Letters, Lewis does have some criticisms of Milton and the way that Satan is portrayed, but nonetheless, he obviously sees great value in Paradise Lost, and he does pull some inspiration from it. And so, as we think about Lewis's take on the devil, his take on the demonic, take on this battle between good and evil, I think that this would benefit you greatly, even if you never get to the actual Paradise Lost by Milton. So do yourself a favor and pick this up. Strongly recommend it. Now, next, moving forward, I am going to start to pull from some of Lewis's letters, and so I would recommend that you pick up a copy of the Letters of C.S. Lewis. A lot of people already have Tolkien's letters, but there's a lot of value in Lewis's letters as well, even though I don't hear them discussed nearly as often. It has a great detailed index for looking up where letters talk about certain subjects, certain people, certain of Lewis's own books, which is, I think, particularly helpful for a study like this. And so, pick up a copy of the Letters of C.S. Lewis. And then, lastly, I would recommend that you pick up a copy of Letters to Malcolm, Chiefly on Prayer, which is the one book I'm recommending that I actually don't have in print, and so I'm going to throw a picture of it on the screen here for a moment. But this really is a beautiful book. I think it's one of Lewis's most overlooked books, especially when it comes to his popular level writing. This is another epistolatory novel, just like the Screwtape Letters, and so it's all told through the letters of C.S. Lewis writing to his friend Malcolm. But unlike Screwtape, this really is an upbuilding work, and so it's all about the Christian life, focusing on prayer, but he deals on a number of different topics. I think that this is just full of so many gems of wisdom, of Christian insight. I would strongly recommend that after you read Screwtape Letters, and maybe you don't have time while this study's going on, maybe you do, but get a copy of Letters to Malcolm. It provides a great upbuilding parallel to what we get in Screwtape. It's the closest thing we have to a sequel, I suppose, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so that's the supplemental reading. Let's go ahead and take a look at the opening of Screwtape Letters. All right, so the Screwtape Letters introduction. Now, first thing I think worth talking about briefly is the fact that it's dedicated to J.R.R. Tolkien, but we're not really told why, and Tolkien doesn't even seem to really know why. In the annotated Screwtape Letters, we are told that this was during the peak of their friendship, and so, maybe Lewis just wanted to dedicate this work to his friend just out of appreciation for Tolkien. I don't know if there's some kind of comedic element here, and if maybe Lewis knew that Tolkien wouldn't really appreciate this book, which, by the way, he did not. I've heard it theorized that maybe there's a philological interest here that, a few times Screwtape talks about the value of language and of corrupting language over time, sort of making things more confusing, emptying out words of their meaning, and maybe that would have some particular interest to Tolkien. Or maybe there's something really authentic and really genuine going on here. Lewis is very clear that Tolkien was instrumental in his conversion to Christianity. And so maybe as Lewis talks about the nature of temptation and by contrast, the nature of the Christian life, he's giving some praise to Tolkien, some appreciation to Tolkien for the role that he had in Lewis's own conversion to Christianity, his beginning of the Christian life. And so maybe there's something like that there, but we don't really know for sure. Now, in a letter that Tolkien wrote to Michael Tolkien just shortly after Lewis's death, Tolkien writes, "Also, I was wryly amused to be told that Lewis himself was never very fond of the Screwtape Letters, his bestseller. He dedicated it to me. I wondered why. Now I know," says they. And so Tolkien seems to say that, okay, maybe Lewis dedicated it to him because Lewis himself didn't like it very much, and maybe there is some kind of joke there. I don't know. It's interesting to think about. I don't think we have any clear answers here. All right, now looking at the origins for Lewis's idea of the letter, and this comes from a letter written to his brother Warren. He writes, "Humphrey came up to see me last night, not in his medical capacity, and we listened to Hitler's speech together. I don't know if I'm weaker than other people, but it is a positive revelation to me how, while the speech lasts, it is impossible not to waver just a little. I should be useless as a schoolmaster or a policeman. Statements which I know to be untrue all but convince me. At any rate for the moment, if only the man says them unflinchingly. The same weakness is why I'm a slow examiner. If a candidate with a bold, mature handwriting attributed Paradise Lost to Wordsworth, I should feel a tendency to go and look it up for fear that he might be right after all. I'd been to church for the first time for many weeks, owing to the illness, and considered myself invalid enough to make a midday communion. Before the service was over, one could wish these things came more reasonably. I was struck with an idea for a book, which I think might be both useful and entertaining. It would be called As One Devil to Another, and would consist of letters from an elderly retired devil to a young devil who had just started work on his first patient. The idea would be to give all the psychology of temptation from the other point of view." So I think it's worth considering that Lewis received this inspiration for the Screwtape Letters a day after listening to and reflecting on his experience of listening to this speech by Adolf Hitler. He notes that when he's listening to this speech, he found it rather compelling. Not because it's true, and don't misunderstand Lewis as saying anything that he's not saying here. Obviously, he speaks extensively about the evils of the Nazis, about the evils of Hitler, and so there's no sympathy for Nazism here. Just the opposite. He's recognizing the demonic power that's at work here, that we're dealing with strong rhetoric, we're dealing with convincing rhetoric that is not attached to reason, that's not attached to truth, that's not attached to goodness. This is sophistry. It is a counterfeit reason, in that it's not actually reason at all. It's sentiment. It's bodily sensation, giving the rise of a sense of causation, a sense of reason, but ultimately it is a counterfeit. And that's because evil is by definition irrational, because reason is tied into the reality of existence itself. All things were made through the Word. All things were made through the Logos of the Father, which is Christ. There's an orderliness. There is a reason that undergirds all of created reality. And as we approach reason, we are approaching that by which we reason, which ultimately is God himself. And so when rhetoric is not moving us in the direction of the beatific vision, but when rhetoric is moving us toward the miserific vision, moving us downward in the direction of hell, we're actually approaching non-being, we're engaging in something that is irrational. This is why we're going to see this continual theme throughout the Screwtape Letters, as Screwtape advises Wormwood not to engage in any kind of debate or any kind of teaching exercise with his patient, but he's going to lead him into not thinking, into confusion, into a anti-reason position. And we see this play out in Paralandra. Sometimes the unman is telling these stories that don't have a clear meaning behind it. They just sort of evoke these sentiments of freedom and liberation and heroism. When in reality, Ransom notes that if you're actually looking at the reason that ties all these together, we're actually getting stories of, he says, perverts and witches. But that's only when you're applying reason and you're trying to see things clearly. When you're just listening to all these stories, they give you these sentiments of liberation, these sentiments of noble sacrifice and of heroism. And so we get that kind of rhetoric that moves against reason, but we also just get that Remember that annoying rhetoric where the unmanned just repeating ransom, ransom, ransom. Henry says, "What is it?" And then the unmanned says, "Nothing. Ransom, ransom, ransom." And I think that both tactics are really doing the same thing through these stories, as well as through just this annoying, repetitive naming of ransom. He's causing the lady, he's causing ransom to close themselves in. And so in the case of the stories, it's this closing in of self-referential so-called heroism, where you're acting not for the good, but ultimately for your good. You're separating yourself from the good. You're closing yourself in. So too, in the annoying rhetoric, he's causing ransom to fixate on his emotional response to his environment rather than focusing on the mission that he has before him. In both cases, the unmanned is trying to get his adversaries to close themselves in. And this is going to be a pretty common theme in Lewis, and especially in his talk of the diabolical, his talk of evil, especially if you already have the Great Divorce in your head. This idea that the more that you move toward evil, the more that you get shut in, the smaller you become. Whereas the more that you move toward what is good, the more that you move toward God, the more that you move toward the fulfillment of all things, the more expansive you become as you give yourself over in love. And so the beatific vision causes you to become bigger than you are. The miserific vision causes you to become smaller than you are. All right, so now let's go ahead and move into the prologue, starting with the original. He says that there are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors and hail a materialist or a magician with the same delight. And so the devils want us to either act like they don't exist and play the materialist, or they want for us to become hyperfixated on them, to glorify them, and to play the magician. And something that Lewis shows us in this book and throughout the Ransom series is that the materialist and the magician are more or less the same thing, that they are both fueled by the demonic, that both are looking to close themselves in from reality and to control the environment around them. In fact, he says in The Abolition of Man, "For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men." And so in other words, the materialist scientist and the magician are both doing the same thing. They're trying to subdue reality to the will of man. And Lewis does an incredible job in the Ransom series of demonstrating this reality. We see how Weston, the physicist, really turns into the demonic spiritualist from between Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandra. We're going to see this theme, this natural relationship between the materialist and the magician, take even more explicit form when we get to that hideous strength. And so this is an idea that we're going to very much see at play in the Ransom series. The materialist and the magician are both doing fundamentally the same thing. They aren't becoming more expansive in their love for that which is good. They're simply trying to close themselves off. They're trying to consume reality for their own individualistic ends. Okay, moving forward. He says that the history of the European war, except insofar as it happens now and then to impinge upon the spiritual condition of one human being, was obviously of no interest to Screwtape. And so I think this is worth taking a look at here, that Screwtape is going to warn Wormwood against getting too excited about the fact that there's a war going on, right? Don't get excited about the carnage. Don't get excited about these external realities and external fears that accompany war, because it's not external realities that are going to save or condemn a soul. It's the internal realities that play here. It's the direction of the soul. It's the presence or absence of faith, which external circumstances don't necessarily create in one direction or another. If anything, wartime tends to make people more aware of their immortality, which can actually cause them to move toward faith. And of course, we see this happen, that during times when mortality seems to be in the news a lot more than others, a lot of times this is when we see a rise in movements toward faith, at least superficial, if not substantial. And this is absolutely in line with Christian wisdom. The idea that freedom is not determined by external realities, but freedom is determined by the right ordering of the soul in harmony with reality, which ultimately means that it's in harmony with who God is and the order that he established within created reality. And so freedom is an internal condition related ultimately to God rather than a state of external circumstance. And so I've talked about Boethius before, and I imagine I'll probably talk about him again. That Boethius, who was falsely accused of sedition, and then he finds himself imprisoned, awaiting ultimately his execution, he's able to discover freedom, not because of the spinning wheel of fortune that's landed him here, but because he's learned to properly relate himself to fortune itself, and ultimately he's learned to properly relate himself to providence. And that is where we discover freedom, not through external circumstance. External circumstances can never provide or diminish your true freedom. And this makes you think of something Augustine said regarding the real evils of war. In Contra Faustum, where we get what's been called his just war doctrine, Augustine says, "What is the evil in war? Is it the death of some who will soon die in any case, that others may live in peaceful subjection? This is mere cowardly dislike, and not any religious feeling. The real evils in war are love of violence, revengeful cruelty, fierce and implacable enmity, wild resistance, and the lust of power, and such like." And so for Augustine, the real evils of war is not the fact that some people die. People are eventually going to die anyways. And so the fact that people die is actually not connected to war itself. Now, it might cause people to die sooner rather than later, but as Screwtape knows, that is not necessarily in itself a bad thing. The real evils of war deal with internal realities, that they might stem up within us, that which we already have. A love for violence, a love for cruelty, for just being hostile toward other people, lust for power, these things, which can be fanned up into bigger flames in wartime, these things are the real evils of war, not the war itself. And I think Screwtape would heartily agree with that. Now, moving to the 1961 prologue, Lewis says that he's often asked the question, do you believe in an actual devil? And he says, okay, if by devil, if you mean something that's equal with God, well, then no. And so he's clarifying against some of these popular understandings of the devil. He says that there's no uncreated being except God. God has no opposite. No being could attain a perfect badness opposite to the perfect goodness of God. For when you have taken away every kind of good thing, intelligence, will, memory, energy, and existence itself, there would be none of him left. And so, as I've said before, reality itself, substance, being, hinges on God. For that reason, being itself is good. And so evil is a movement toward non-being, but can never actually become non-being. The devil, in that he exists and has intelligence, will, memory, energy, and existence, is good. Ontologically, regarding his basic, that he exists, these are good things. However, his evil is that he uses these good things provided and upheld by God for bad ends. He directs his will, he directs his attention away from God rather than to God, and that is the nature of evil. As Augustine says in The City of God, this then is the original evil. We have turned our hearts away from that light that would make us a light if we would set our hearts upon him. And so what evil is a continual movement away from being. But as long as you have something that's moving, you have something that exists. And anything that exists is good in that it exists. Evil deals with the orientation of the soul. It deals with the orientation of the power that something has. But the power that it has to do evil is itself good. And I think that's something worth emphasizing. The devil has no power to create, only to bend, only to corrupt, only to pervert. In the preface to Paradise Lost, C.S. Lewis says that Satan's revolt is entangled in contradictions from the very outset. He wants hierarchy and does not want hierarchy. Throughout the poem, he is engaged in sawing off the branch he is sitting on, not only in the quasi-political sense already indicated, but in a deeper sense still, since a creature revolting against a creator is revolting against the source of his own powers, including even his power to revolt. He has become more a lie than a liar, a personified self-contradiction. This doom he has brought upon himself. In order to avoid seeing one thing, he has, almost voluntarily, incapacitated himself from seeing at all. So evil is a willful blindness. It's a turning away from that by which you turn. That's what we find in the devil, and that's what we find in all who follow the miserific path. Now, because the devil has this willful disorientation, he's not able to see himself in proper context. He doesn't see himself in proper relation toward that which is above and beyond, and ultimately more significant than him. And so for that reason, the devil takes himself very seriously. Pride is the original sin. Satan, said Chesterton, fell through a force of gravity. We must picture hell as a state where everyone is perpetually concerned about his own dignity and advancement, where everyone has a grievance, and where everyone lives the deadly, serious passions of envy, self-importance, and resentment. And of course, Chesterton also famously said that angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. And that's because they recognize their context. They recognize the fact that they are part of a broader reality that is more significant than them. And because they're able to recognize their proper station in the grand cosmic hierarchy, well, they're able to not close in on themselves, but to expand themselves outwardly. And in so doing, they are freed from the gravity that Satan experiences that pulls him ever downward. And this connects to the two quotations we're given at the end of the prologue. One from Martin Luther: "The best way to drive out the devil, if he will not yield to text of Scripture, is to jeer and flout him, for he cannot bear scorn." And also Thomas More: "The devil, the proud spirit, cannot endure to be mocked." I think it's also worth noting that Lewis here, he quotes from Martin Luther as well as Thomas More, from a Protestant as well as a Catholic. I think this speaks well to his mere Christianity mindset. I do appreciate Lewis's continual attempts at being ecumenical here. I think that what he's doing in giving us these two quotations from these two sources is he's demonstrating the fact that Catholics and Protestants have a common enemy, namely the devil. Now here he explains why his vision of hell and of the lowerarchy takes a bureaucratic form. He says, "The greatest evil is not now done in those sordid dens of crime that Dickens loved to paint. It is not done even in concentration camps and labor camps. In those we see its final result. But it is conceived and ordered, moved, seconded, carried, and minuted, in clean, carpeted, warmed, and well-lighted offices, by quiet men with white collars and cut fingernails, and smooth-shaven cheeks, who do not need to raise their voice. Hence, naturally enough, my symbol for hell is something like the bureaucracy of a police state, or the office of a thoroughly nasty business concern." And this, I think, is brilliant, right? When we tend to think of abject evil, we tend to think of the concentration camp. We tend to think of the labor camp. However, these are things that are ultimately created, not spontaneously, but they're created by bureaucrats. They're created by politicians. They're created by people who tend to not get their hands dirty themselves, but who organize that hands would be made dirty. And we're going to see this image play out in very clear terms when we get to that hideous strength. And so this is, I think, a good lead up to what we're going to see there. And then he talks a little bit about what it is that's driving the demonic. What is the inspiration? What is the ambition for these creatures of hell? And he says that, he's envisioning in his imaginative telling of this that that demons ultimately seek to literally consume each other. We see that play out in the Screwtape Letters. And he's using this imagery. He's using this imaginative device in order to get at something real. And he says, "It is, I feign, for this that devils desire human souls and the souls of one another. It is for this that Satan desires all of his followers and all the sons of Eve and all the hosts of heaven. He dreams of the day when all shall be inside him, and all that says, I, can say it only through him." And so remember, evil seeks to close itself inside, and ultimately what evil wants to do is close everything inside. This is what pride does. It wants to bring everything into its own orbit. And so Satan, as the Archon of Thocandra, doesn't want to participate in the chorus of the heavens that's ultimately trying to move in the direction of God, but what he wants to do is to orient the heavens toward himself. And so, we tend to say that the medievals put Earth at the center of the cosmos, but really that is how the devil would want us to see it. And Lewis talks about this in Discarded Image and elsewhere. He says that a better way to look at it is not actually to put Earth at the center, but Earth is something like on the periphery of the cosmos. It's outside the city walls, as it is outside of the heavens, outside of the heavenly chorus. And so In reality, in this model, the Earth is at the periphery of the cosmos and should strive to move toward the center, which is God. But the devil wants to move everything in his own orbit, rather than recognizing that which he necessarily does orbit. And this reminded me of a passage in Paralandra, in which we're told, "There was no doubt a confusion of persons in damnation. What pantheists falsely hoped of heaven, bad men really received in hell. They were melted down into their master, as a lead soldier slips down and loses his shape in the ladle held over the gas ring. The question whether Satan, or one whom Satan had digested, is acting on any given occasion, has in the long run no clear significance." And so Lewis talks about how as we fulfill our potential, as we achieve our ideal in God, we actually become more of ourselves. We become more of who we are meant to be. We give ourselves away that we might actually be given back. We surrender Isaac that he might be more fully his. We die to self that we might become ourselves. And I love this statement from Kierkegaard from one of his journals, in which he says, "By God's help, I shall become myself." Whereas when we move away from God, when we move toward Satan as master, we don't become more ourselves. We simply become more of Satan and an extension of Satan. Because remember, reason itself is melted down, and reason is necessary in order to have particulars. If you don't apply reason to the world, then all you have is one undifferentiated, massive stuff. And this is what we become when we move away from reason and we move into Satan. Now, I already mentioned this, but he says that some people have paid me an undeserved compliment by supposing that my letters were the ripe fruit of many years' study in moral and ascetic theology. They forget that there is an equally reliable, though less creditable, way of learning how temptation works. My heart, I need no others, showeth me the wickedness of the ungodly. And he notes that this is why the Screwtape Letters was actually relatively easy for him to write, even though in the end he didn't like it, because he had to really fall into his worst tendencies. To fall, all you have to do is to let go. And so it's not difficult for him to do, but he didn't like kind of letting his guard down. He didn't like sinking into this element of his existence. Lewis likes to write upbuilding accounts. He likes to write positively about how we move toward the beatific vision, how we move toward what reality fundamentally is. And obviously this book is trying to get us to do that, but by first falling and demonstrating the inversion of reality. And that is taxing. It's got to be spiritually taxing. It has to be morally taxing. And so on one hand, this is easy to write, but he didn't necessarily like writing it. He was asked why he didn't write a sequel to this book. Why don't you write a companion book that comes from the other side, an angelic correspondence? And to that, he says that ultimately he just wasn't qualified to do that. He says that everything about it would have to smell of heaven, and that's just not something that he felt he was qualified to achieve. It's much easier for him to give an account of evil than it is to give a first-hand account of goodness. And I think that demonstrates a nobility, a great Christian humility. Now, that being said, we do have, from one of his notebooks, a small little fragment that Brenton Dickinson has called the Archangel fragment. And this seems to be a short-lived attempt at providing an angelic correspondence. And so this is all we have from this. And so this is what Lewis said, I assume speaking as one angel to another. "For this, my dear, is the true delight, to take a creature whom, if the king permitted and our own will were so strangely perverted, we could, with one touch of the little finger, turn into nothingness, even as that creature could spoil the down on a butterfly's wings. A creature so short-lived that its whole mortal life rushes past us in a moment. A creature so feeble in understanding that only by gazing long and reverently into its mind can we discern its difference from the brutes. To take such a puppet, such an all but nothing, to hold back our strength and nurse its tiny freedom as one who nurses a little spark into flame. To bear with its follies, to love its deformities, to remake every day and hour what it destroys, to watch, to prune, to bear it as a woman bears a man in her womb, and all in hope of the day when it shall be exalted, beyond its nature, against its nature, into something not only our equal, but our superior, to train the infant God, ever waiting for the day when we can reverence it, who is now too blind to reverence us. That, my child, is the real joy, the endless fascination, the lovely irony, the imperishable reward. And so I don't know, maybe and probably Lewis was right in saying that he's not qualified to write from an angel's perspective. But I think we see something that has the potential here to be something, whatever that something is. And I think we see something like this play out when we see Malacandra and Paralandra take their place beneath Tor and Tinadril in this hierarchy, when Tor and Tinadril, who were originally below the Oyarsu in this hierarchy, now enter into their glory. Now they're exalted above, to the point where Tor and Tinadril are able to decide what Paralandra is going to do next. Is she going to just go off into the heavens, or is she going to stay there to serve them as their agent? And this, of course, speaks to Scripture, when we're told on one hand in the Psalms that we were made a little bit lower than the angels. And then Paul says to the Corinthians that we are going to judge the angels. And so I think that we see this play out pretty remarkably in this prose here that Lewis gives us. And it'd be interesting to see where he would have gone with this, but of course he didn't, and so we'll never know. This is all that we have. But the closest that we do get to a positive counterpart to Screwtape Letters would probably be Letters to Malcolm, as I've already mentioned. And so it's not anything like the correspondence of Angels to Angels, but it does give us this upbuilding epistolatory novel. I think it provides a good follow-up to Screwtape that follows the same format but leads us in an upbuilding positive direction. And so I do recommend that you read that after you finish Screwtape at some point. And then lastly for this video, I've kind of already mentioned this here and there, but you may be asking the question, why are we doing Screwtape right now and not starting on That Hideous Strength after finishing Paralandra? Well, when I first read Paralandra, I just felt like Screwtape naturally belonged here. I thought that Screwtape and Paralandra together would form a pretty powerful study of the demonic, of evil, of our experience of temptation. And then I came to discover Brenton Dickinson's article, A Cosmic Find in the Screwtape Letters, and realized that in Lewis's mind, Screwtape Letters originally belonged in the Ransomverse. As Dickinson discovered that in an early handwritten prologue to the Screwtape Letters, Ransom was actually the person who discovered and intercepted this correspondence from Screwtape, which was originally written in Old Solar. And so we get this extra paragraph to the original prologue in this handwritten draft from Lewis. And so this is what was in that original handwritten draft. That is not in the original prologue as published. And so Lewis wrote, "But it is, however, too late to make any mystery of the process whereby Dr. Ransom learned the language. The original of these letters is written in what may be called Old Solar, the primitive speech of all rational creatures inhabiting the solar system. How Ransom came to learn it, I have already related in a book called Out of the Silent Planet. But when I wrote that book, he and I were both mistaken in supposing it to be the local speech of a single world, that world which its inhabitants called Malacandra. We now know better, but there is no time within this preface to discuss the problems of extraterrestrial philology involved. But it should be added that the translation is necessarily very free. The capital letters used for pronouns when they refer to that being whom Screwtape describes as the enemy are, for example, a most ingenious device of Ransom's for representing a quite different and involuntary phenomenon in the original. On the other hand, many words mentioned where Screwtape is discussing what he calls the philological arm were already English, for naturally, devils whose terrain is England are well skilled in the language of their proposed victims." Now, even though this didn't make it into the published version, in my mind, in my heart, this is still canon, at least headcanon if nothing else. Being a big fan of the Ransom series, I love thinking that this is part of the same story, but also I just think that it fits really well. It gives us some more insight into what was going on in the mind and the strategy of the Unman. It also connects well with some themes that we're going to see in That Hideous Strength. And so I think that right between Paralandra and That Hideous Strength is a perfect place for reading and for studying and for really thinking deeply about the Screwtape Letters. Also, as a side note, I think that we're going to see some connections to the Dark Tower as well, which we are going to discuss once we finish the Ransom series. And so even though I'm not considering that core reading, I do think it's something that is worth reading and something that we are going to discuss. And so if you're able to make it around to it, then I do recommend that you give that a read or give that a listen at some point before we get to the end of That Hideous Strength. But that's it for now. In the next video, I'm going to go through letter by letter and provide some thoughts along the way. But until then, Godspeed.